Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Sarah Jane McGibbon will defend the academic thesis entitled Non-State Effective Territorial Entities, a Critical Appraisal of International Legal Capacity and Responsibility. Dear candidates, may I please invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Corona, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear family, both here in Maastricht and online, today I have the privilege and challenge of explaining to you in an easily digestible format the content of my dissertation titled Non-State Effective Territorial Entities, a Critical Appraisal of International Legal Capacity and Responsibility. But how does one cover a 5-year research journey in 15 minutes or less? I'm going to attempt to do this in the following manner. First, we'll start with a little Public International Law 101. Then I'm going to take you through the catalogue of non-state territorial entities. After that, I'll explain the particular objectives of my research, how I set out to achieve them, as well as my results. By the end of this, it is my wish that you will agree with me that the way in which we currently treat states as the only actors who matter in the international community is both unsuitable for the factual and political realities of the world and not a true reflection of the law as it is. But let's start at the beginning. One of the first things we teach our international law students is about legal subjects. And it's kind of a technical legal term, all about actors whose conduct attracts legal consequences, particularly within the international legal framework. So I'm going to ask you today to think about this as the concept of legal actors. And the most important actor that we've understood for a long time in international law is states. They're a little hard to really define, but there are essentially 4 key requirements in order to be considered a state from customary international law, one of the important sources of international law, that are enunciated in the Montevideo Convention. These are territory, population, effective government, and capacity to enter into international relations. Now, the issue of recognition is a thorny one, and although it's not officially a requirement, it is practically very important. Now, the other category we deal with is then the concept of non-state actors. One of the big ones you'll have heard about is the UN as an international organization. Another one that we talk more about these days is as having some kind of legal personality or legal subjecthood as non-state armed groups. But there's also things like individuals, you and me, or multinational corporations, for example, in climate change law. The one we weren't going to talk about today, and the one that I've spent the last 5 years thinking about, is non-state effective territorial entities. Now, to give you a really technical definition of these are things that look and feel kind of like states, but aren't states as we understand them in international law. So, what did I investigate? What does this mean? There are essentially 2 pillars of legal subjecthood: capacity and responsibility. Capacity means the ability to take on rights and obligations, whereas responsibility means the ability to be held accountable or responsible for violations or breaches of international law. Now, I see and conceptualize these as 2 sides of the same coin. So if you have capacity or obligations and responsibility, obligations and duties, responsibility must flow from that. Now, ultimately, the sort of biggest legal subjects, as I said to you, have been states. They are what we call full legal persons or have full legal subjecthood, full capacity, full responsibility. And that has led to what I call the state, non-state binary in international law, or it's one of the contributing factors at least. So with the state, non-state binary, we essentially have an international legal system where it matters if you are a state or not, with the state being kind of the top level actor, gold prize, gold star stuff. But we had a case before the International Court of Justice some years back called the Reparation Advisory Opinion, where the court was dealing with the United Nations. And in that advisory opinion, the court created room for a more pluralist or inclusive conception of international law, where they create this sliding scale of personality. And this sliding scale means that statehood and subjecthood, having capacity and responsibility, are separated. You don't have to be a state in order to have capacity and responsibility. And this allows us to subject new actors to the rules of international law and allows for the regulation of non-state actor conduct. But the court didn't tell us exactly how this works. So, I thought about this in the context of these non-state effective territorial entities. Now, these kinds of entities occur all over the world. They take on different forms. But the most important thing is that territory, in some form, is still central to international law. And that's why we're looking at these, because international law is constantly confronted with the question of what to do with these entities. Their actions may have significant consequences from humanitarian, social, economic, and political perspectives. And there are a number of rules in international law that are impacted by the status of these entities. So, for example, the obligations of the governments in the territories from the perspective of human rights, the classification of armed conflicts, the status of asylum seekers who originate from these territories. But these are all very specific practical questions that cannot be solved meaningfully, at least in my view, without considering the underlying legal framework which governs the principles that are drawn therefrom. So we think about this and we look at these territories. Now, you might have seen them under different names: breakaway states, unrecognized states, statelets, putative states, de facto states, contested states, aspirant states, or state-like entities. These all mean something slightly different, but the one I'm concerned with is non-state effective territorial entities. So how do we tackle this problem of looking at capacity and responsibility and trying to establish what is wrong or right with the underlying international legal system? I set out to determine the status of non-state effective territorial entities from the perspective of capacity and responsibility. And as a side mission, some practical effects of distinguishing non-state effective territorial entities from states. Now, the important thing about my research is that I assume the non-statehood of these entities. None of my research is conducted to determine whether the entities are or are not states, or whether there's any validity, legal or moral, to their claims, but I accept that they are not states and conduct my assessment from that starting point. The ultimate goal in establishing the status of them and conducting the research the way I do is to show that the problems that come from having such a binary international legal system are not only theoretical, but practical too. So how do I get there? I looked at what I call for situation territories. That is Somaliland, Taiwan, ISIL in Syria, and Crimea. Now, these all look quite different, and I think that's important because it goes to what I call a spectrum of non-state effective territorial entities. There's no one definition, or there's no one territory that always looks the same to meet this definition, but that we need to understand, in fact, that there are multiple actors that fall within this category and that they are all significant. What unites these four very distinct, otherwise very distinct entities is that they present a significant practical challenge to the international legal framework as we know it. So what did I do? In chapter 3, I had a look at Somaliland under the law of secession, and I considered whether Somaliland might have a right to secede from Somalia as a failed state. This chapter drew out some interesting results on the themes of territorial integrity versus the right to self-determination, as well as effectiveness versus recognition. I then moved on in chapter 3 to Taiwan, where I considered the use of force by non-state effective territorial entities in self-defense. This chapter forced me to confront the question of whether customary international law applies to non-state effective territorial entities, particularly in the context on the rules on the use of force. In the following chapter on ISIL in Syria, I flipped the question on its head and asked whether force may be used against non-state effective territorial entities. And this chapter revealed some interesting findings in relation to responsibility based on the distinction between state and non-state. In the final substantive chapter of the dissertation, I considered the application of the Russia-Ukraine bilateral investment treaty in Crimea. And the main question that this chapter focused on was the role of non-recognition for the application of treaties in non-state effective territorial entities. So there were three key themes that sort of came out of this research. The most major one being in the title of the dissertation, capacity and responsibility. The second one with significant findings was recognition versus effectiveness. And finally, territorial integrity versus self-determination. Now, because this is just an abridged version of the thesis, I'm only going to focus on the first of these three, capacity and responsibility. But I understand that on the windowsill outside the store, there are in fact copies of the book if you would like to read the full version. Highly recommend it. Turning to the conclusions on capacity and responsibility. So what my research shows is that customary international law in fact imposes rights and obligations on non-state effective territorial entities, or may impose rights and obligations on non-state effective territorial entities. And this means, if you remember from our sort of Public International Law 101, that they have some form of capacity under international law. But this is not capacity in the binary sense that we've always sort of understood it as, but it's rather a spectrum of international legal capacity. So different non-state effective territorial entities have different rights and obligations depending on the needs of the international community. And this is based on the pragmatic and dynamic nature of customary international law, which allows us to see that these entities can assume functional capacities. And in this way, we don't overemphasize recognition, which we can see as state consent, in the role that these entities have in the international community. So it allows us to regulate non-state effective territorial entities, which is great in terms of both the challenges they pose and the benefits that they bring to the international community. But when you look at the flip side of that coin, responsibility, we see that wrongful conduct is always attributed to a state, including through the use of principles such as strict liability. And this means that effectively we are denying these entities responsibility. And if these really are two sides of the same coin, that doesn't make sense. So we have this theoretical incoherence that's created by the state, non-state binary. So trying to shoehorn these entities into this idea of us being a state or not a state, and your capacity and responsibility attaching to that. So what do I think about the state, non-state binary? Well, I think that such a polarized approach leads to gaps in regulation, and this is illustrated through studying the practical questions in each of the chapters in the thesis. This theoretical incoherence has very real consequences, and this is shown through studying the law of secession, use of force, application of investment treaties. So what we should really stop trying to do is shoehorning these territorial entities into this state, non-state binary, seeing them as entities or territories trying to achieve statehood, and see them for what they are, non-state effective territorial entities. We should break this binary and see the full spectrum of these entities and allow that spectrum to take its rightful place in international law. So this modified approach to non-state effective territorials is both required and helpful. The groundwork for doing this has already been laid by the ICJ in their reparation advisory opinion, where they created scope for a more inclusive, pluralist understanding of international law. And what we need to do as international lawyers is accept the ICJ's invitation to break this binary and to put a stop to this primacy of states and centrality of states in international law, and allow these non-state effective territorial entities to be seen as the actors that they are within the international community. Thank you for your attention. I now hand back to the Pro-Rector.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Lijnzaad. Professor Lijnzaad is Professor of the Practice of International Law at our university, and she is also the chair of the Assessment Committee.
Madam Candidate, thank you for your introduction to a book that is very interesting. It's well written. It contains a lot of information. And in part, you are looking at an old question, but it is, I think, a new question as well. And you have tried to find new answers to these questions. I would like to take you to chapter 3 of your book, in particular paragraph 5, where you discuss customary law in relation to Taiwan and mostly in relation to armed conflict and international humanitarian law. Now, let me just find where I am. I was somewhat concerned, or surprised perhaps is the better word, about how little attention you have given to the ICRC's extensive study on customary international humanitarian law, where it hardly appears in your footnotes. So maybe you see its relevance in a different way than I do. You may remember that this study was initiated to investigate which of the rules of IHL as treaty-based law had by then become accepted as customary law, in particular in relation to non-international armed conflict as rules also binding on non-state actors. My impression is that a lot of the underlying research and the underlying theory for that ICRC study is directly related to the subject matter of your thesis, or are we misunderstanding one another here? Related to that, a further question could be whether Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions is perhaps a precursor to the applicability of the customary laws of war to non-state effective territories. Would you agree with that view? I'd like to hear your comments, please.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I think in chapter 3, and in particular in paragraph 5 of that chapter, I try to take a very broad approach to this question of whether customary international law applies to non-state effective territorial entities. And I think ultimately there are some losses in that where you draw a line where you can't bring in everything. Your comments on this are very helpful for me too in terms of taking this research forward and what would be what readers would like to see more of in this section. So I thank you for that. But in considering the ICRC report and indeed their sort of thoughts on which rules of customary IHL apply to non-international actors, I didn't place heavy reliance on the ICRC report because I feel that report applies more strictly to non-state armed groups, not only non-state armed groups, of course, but I feel that the focus there is very heavily on non-state armed groups, whereas I'm trying to work within a more underlying public international law framework rather than in the lex specialis kind of framework that you have there. In terms of Common Article 3 and that being a precursor to the applicability of IHL to non-state effective territorial entities, I think that you're correct, and I do agree with your view that this could be seen as a precursor to this. How do we extend the application of customary international law more generally? As you said in your introduction, this is essentially an old question and one that many people have grappled with in different ways over the years. And I think that my choices that I made in this research were to approach it from this more than general perspective and to focus on these very specific problems in this chapter, in particular, the use of force by non-state effective territorial entities. So I didn't focus too much on the development from Common Article 3 there, but I do agree with your perspective on that.
Are you satisfied with the answer? In that case, the opposition will be continued by Professor Tzladi. Professor Tzladi is Professor of International Law at the University of Pretoria, and he also holds the South African Research Chair in International Constitutional Law. He's a member of the Assessment Committee, and he is joining us online for this ceremony. And I would like to welcome him very much to Maastricht University today. Very good to have you. Please also ask you to unmute, Professor. Yes, great.
So thank you very much. Dear candidate, thank you for this book, which I read with great interest. There is much in it that I have enjoyed. But of course, the purpose of today is to oppose, and so I shall oppose. By asking you a question and asking you to elaborate a little bit, it's a methodological question. In your thesis as a whole, you take a look at four situations of non-state effective territories, as you call them. But in each, you look at different, what you call focal points, and what I would call maybe problems, but you look at 4 different focal points for each. And my question is whether or not that does not have a methodological impact, in the sense that it undermines a coherence that would otherwise be there if you perhaps identified one focal point. Because by identifying one focal point, we would be able to see how the solutions you have reached compare to one another. So it might in fact serve as a kind of a golden thread, if you like. Let's take, for example, your chapter, I believe it's chapter 2, in which the solution that you put forward is a solution of dissolving secession for Somalia. I wonder how this solution of dissolving secession would apply, say, for example, to Crimea. Would this not mean that the fait accompli created by the breach of the prohibition on the use of force would then have to be accepted? And if that's the case, what would this mean for, say, for example, the duty not to recognize serious breaches of jus cogens?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I think there were some methodological choices here that may seem surprising in the context of a legal thesis, and I think this kind of very distinct approach of going with a very distinct question in each chapter is one of those choices. I don't think it is a question that I've thought quite long and hard about throughout the research, and at the beginning of the research too, when embarking on it, is what am I sacrificing if I don't approach each territory with the exact same set of questions? But also, what do I gain from that? And ultimately, this research project is just a starting point, or should just be a starting point, I would hope, for further research and development on these issues. And I made the decision to look at each of these distinct issues because I think that there is still sufficient similarity between the underlying territories and the focus on the underlying principles of public international law in order to draw useful conclusions from them. What I would hope would then be kind of the next step is, in fact, to then go and consider the kinds of questions you have asked today and put those questions to each of the different territories and test those theories at another level. But I think that those ultimately are very specific practical questions, and what the research ultimately seeks to do is to reach conclusions on these kind of fundamental, more broadly applicable principles. And I don't think that the coherence is on that perspective is lost by approaching each of the situation territories with a different question. So hopefully the next step then is to go forward and test them further and see how much these theories hold out, bearing in mind also that each of these territories is different, and that's the point of acknowledging the spectrum, is that there might be different practical outcomes, but this underlying theory should hold in each case.
You satisfied with the answer?
May I just ask one follow-up question? So if I may ask a follow-up question, is it possible that the solutions you arrive at, moving away from the binary approach, might open up other gaps?
Thank you for the follow-up question. And yes, it's entirely possible. I think that one has to accept in research that your research might not be foolproof, and that's the point of the research, right, is to put the ideas out there, have others engage with it, and to have this exchange of ideas and determine where the faults lie, and to ultimately come to a better solution for the framework together. So I don't consider my research infallible by any means, but I would at least like to hope that it gets us talking about the problems that are out there.
Thank you so much. Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Fortin. Professor Fortin is Associate Professor of Public International Law and Human Rights at Utrecht University, and she is also a member of the Assessment Committee. And I would like to welcome her also very much to Maastricht today. You have the floor.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I want to start by giving you compliments about the study, in particular your ambition to try and break out of the theoretical realm by road testing the legal framework on certain issues and certain non-state effective territorial entities. My question pertains to another old question, one that's been studied and thought about by many other scholars. Sometimes when thinking about non-state actors, legal personality and customary international law, we find ourselves trapped in a circular reasoning. Mm-hmm. So for an example of that, you say it's at page 75 in chapter 3, in order for customary international law to apply to non-state actors, broadly they must have legal capacity or personality. This suggests that the personality comes first. Yet others have argued that holding rights and obligations comes first, in the sense that it's perhaps only one of several criteria for the holding of legal personality. So we have a chicken and an egg dilemma. Does personality flow from obligations, or do obligations flow from personality? Mm-hmm. And I want to hear from you your theory of how you see the rules of general customary international law to become binding upon non-state effective territorial entities. In particular, I'm curious to hear more about what you see to be the transformative moments or transformative forces in that process. So what is it, in your view, that causes a non-state effective territorial entity to go from being not bound to customary international law at one moment to being bound by customary international law at the next? What is the role of state consent, if any, in that process? And what is the role of the practice and opinio juris of the non-state effective territorial entity itself, if any, in that process? I think it's only by asking these kinds of questions that we can break out of that circularity. So I'd like to hear your views. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your questions. Thank you for bearing with me for a moment as I jot them all down. Just to make sure that I have them all, if that's all right with you, you would like to hear more about when they become bound or not bound by customary international law, those transformative moments, what the role of state consent is in that process, and the effect of non-state effective territorial entity practice on opinio juris, if I understood correctly, or was that one the other way around?
Yeah, so I'm basically asking about the transformative forces. So I've given you some examples. It might be state consent, and it might be the role of the practice and opinio juris of the entities themselves. But it could be that you have a different theory. So I'm open to that. So my question was indeed the transformative moments and forces, the role of state consent, and the role of the practice and opinio juris of the entities themselves.
So I think that, thank you very much again for the clarification. I think that there's kind of two issues here that this kind of problem is tugging on. One is the distinction between capacity and personality, if there is a distinction between those two. or at least that is one of the things that affects it, and then the rules themselves and the normative value of the rules themselves. So there is indeed a lot of circular reasoning, and particularly in this space, around capacity, personality, responsibility. And I think that, in fact, Professor Jure Widmar has written about this from the responsibility context. And I know that many others have focused, including yourself, on the question of capacity and personality too. For me, to start then with when they might be bounded, we need to focus on this question of who has capacity. And I think that ultimately there's been an over-terminologization of these kinds of terms, where personality is often used to describe what I would more accurately consider capacity. But that kind of issue aside, I think that personality comes as a consequence of capacity, or capacity describes personality rather than the other way around. And I think that that view is something that then influences my understanding very much of when are these entities bound and what is that transformative moment. And I think that by focusing then on this more, it's what I guess Rowan Nicholson calls or not just Rowan Nicholson, but many others call the formal conception of personality, is that this is then this personality, or then I think this capacity that leads to that, it kind of comes from norms being directed at that actor. So I think this is the relationship between these two. So we first have the actor itself and whether they have the capacity to take on norms and obligations. And in that then traditionally the role of state consent has been very overemphasized, I think, as recognition. So are they recognized or not? And the capacity flows from that recognition. I think just on this point too, that the term personality in its genealogy at least invites more binary thinking, and that's the kind of thinking I'm trying to break out of, which is why I've maybe been a little more fuzzy on some of this stuff, because I think that capacity flowing from personality, I think thinking of it just in terms of capacity is a much more helpful way to do it. And I think that my research confirms that, in fact, this is more reflective of how things generally work in practice rather than what we want to say in theory. So we have this point where we determine whether they have capacity or not based on that ability. And then I think there's the second point where we can look at the rules themselves and determine whether the rules are directed at particular actors. And that is where there's the distinction then between the different non-state effective territorial entities and different rules applying to different entities and perhaps differently. Now, I think that, of course, there is still then the role of state consent in that process because of how rules are considered to be formed in international law. But I think at least that by adopting an approach of looking at capacity first and adopting this idea that there can be functional capacity and that it's not just a question of you have it or you don't based on your identity as a state or not, helps us around that a little bit because we can start being a little bit more generous in our approach to these things, a little bit more flexible in our understanding of these things. So I don't think, as it is at the moment, state practice is suddenly going to become irrelevant in this process. But I think that if we start looking more at the actual functional capacity of these entities, it will then help us also to understand whether those norms might be directed at entities that are not just states. Not sure if that was very clear.
The final part of my question was whether you saw any role for the practice and opinio juris of the entities themselves.
Well, I know what the official view on that matter is, and that their practice is not considered in the formation of customary law so much, but I think that if we start viewing subjecthood as something that is more on a spectrum rather than binary, then we do open up the door to thinking more about the role that they can play in formation. And I think that ultimately in practice we do see that they are playing a role maybe not in paper in the formal kind of proceedings of lawmaking, but I think that the conduct of these entities, which are very powerful economically in humanitarian situations and whatnot, ultimately is very meaningful, and they do have a significant impact on that. So I think that at least for now, we can still sort of see them as having a role in that process, even if it is indirect or informal.
Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Selin, who is Assistant Professor of International Law at our university and who is also a member of the Assessment Committee.
And dear candidate and dear Sarah, let me also join the others in congratulating you, and I really enjoyed reading your book. It was very well written and very insightful. So thank you very much for your contribution. So I have a question as to your choice of situation studies. Because on one of the first pages of your thesis, you write that there is a pressing need to understand the difficulties that these non-state effective territorial entities pose to our understanding of international law. And you seem to highlight that this is particularly relevant for international human rights law. And I agree, unsurprisingly. So, of course, on page 5, you continue saying that addressing the question of the applicability of human rights treaties, that is particularly interesting. So my question is really quite simple then. Why did you not dedicate a chapter or part of your thesis addressing this question and examining the legal capacity and responsibilities of these entities from a human rights perspective, considering you identify this as a pressing need? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Again, this is an issue that I thought quite hard about at the beginning of the study. I'll say again to you what I said to some of my earlier highly esteemed opponents, and that is, I think that the research ultimately aims to draw out conclusions that are applicable from a general public international law perspective. And international human rights has sort of developed its own life and become this very wonderful but very intricate specialized regime. And I think that, to be honest with you, it's much more helpful to just start at the beginning here and to go back to the first principles, study them and identify flaws that are there that then might help and flow through to these different areas of law. And I then thought that, well, actually, this is the place to start. It's the fundamental principles, and these principles should then be transferable into these more specialized areas. Now, the question of why I didn't study a particular international human rights topic, again, I think that this is a very specialized area of law, and it's something that I hope to study further in future. And this is, again, an area where I think that these theories could be very usefully tested in the space of an important area of law.
Maybe I could then follow up. So then just very simply also, why then your focus on bilateral treaty, the investment treaties, considering, would you consider that not a specific like lex specialis regime, or would you, and could you apply what you found in that chapter then more generally to human rights law?
Thank you for the excellent follow-up question. I think that I did want to include research that wasn't just focused on multilateral relations, even though there is still an element of these multilateral relations within the chapter on Crimea because of the confusion about who's actually in the game there. So I wanted to include bilateral obligations, and this was a good topic to do that because there is some research, but not a lot of research on that. We are starting to see some of the judgments out of the tribunals there, which makes it helpful. And yes, it is a specialized regime for sure. But I thought that it would be more important then to include this bilateral study of the bilateral obligations instead of focusing on another area where it's more multilateral relations. But I do think that, again, we could test those theories in the area of international human rights.
Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Broderick. Professor Broderick holds the UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Peace at our university, and I'm very happy to give her the floor.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, dear Sarah, congratulations on reaching this point in your PhD trajectory. I also thoroughly enjoyed reading your thesis. I found it both informative at the same time as eloquently written and revealing in terms of shedding new light on existing questions, as has already been said, older questions. At its core, your thesis engages with the phenomenon of the increasing role of non-state actors in international spheres and how these actors operate within the existing structures of international law. You have referred in your presentation to the pluralist conception of international law, and this is exactly what my question is about. So you've said that this conception of international law put forward by the court allows for the rejection of the state-centric notion of international law, and that by reconceptualizing international law in this manner, it extends the scope in some ways. Now, my question relates to the concept of fragmentation, which is something you didn't touch on in your thesis, so I just want to push you a bit in that direction. How do you see the increasing role played by non-state actors in terms of the structures and rules of international law in the longer term? So I'm not referring to fragmentation in terms of international issue areas, rather vertical fragmentation or fragmentation ratione personae. So how do you see this issue of fragmentation based on the findings of your thesis?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for that question. I think the research is constantly at the edge of fragmentation, and it is something that I've thought about since finishing the thesis, more of saying, should I have engaged more with fragmentation? I'm not convinced that the increasing role of non-state actors is what is kind of one of the significant contributing factors to this issue of fragmentation in international law. And I think that that's also why I made one of the methodological choices here was to look at these underlying fundamental structures and principles, was because I think that then, I don't want to say helps with the issue of fragmentation, but I think to some extent it bolsters the research against the problem of fragmentation in international law because you're looking at the underlying principles. And I didn't want to develop a set of answers that were specific to each problem. I also don't think that this problem and the kind of challenges that I'm describing here are in any way new. So I don't think that they're necessarily a problem. Let me phrase this better. I don't think that they're necessarily a new issue that's pushing on this structural fragmentation in international law. I think it's always been there, but we've been more reluctant to talk about it and more reluctant to confront openly the challenges that it actually places on the legal system. So I think that now that we talk more openly about it, I think that it's actually helpful from a fragmentation perspective, because we can start to talk about the fundamental underlying issues and perhaps bring some of that back a little bit through that conversation.
Now, I am very happy to have the opportunity to allow Professor Lijnzaad to continue the discussion.
Thank you, and dear candidate, as I said, I really liked reading your book, but sometimes you stumble across a sentence where you wonder, where did that come from? And in particular, I'm referring to page 78, where you, after some discussion about what the ILC did with respect to the identification of international customary law, on page 77, then on the top of page 78, you refer to what D'Aspremont has noted, and then we get to, it's a very intriguing part of your text. So D'Aspremont, you quote him, notes that the recognition of this fact, the fact that non-state actors can be bound by norms of customary international law led to debates about whether they may also be involved in its formation. That's logical, I would say. But then you tell us that notion was dismissed by the ILC in its 2018 report. And there we go. Direct obligations are also placed on deep seabed mining corporations under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is true. I take an active interest in the law of the sea, as you may know. And then it continues in the text with the extent to which human rights obligations may directly bind non-state actors is also a question of great debate. Now, I find this somewhat puzzling. I'm not sure how the contractor in deep seabed mining ended up in your thesis, if I can put it like that, or how that contractor is connected to either the discussion about the input or influence of non-state entities on the development of customary law. I take it you are not talking about the customary law of deep seabed mining, because I would wonder if that actually exists, or is this related to the debate on how customary human rights obligations may bind non-state actors? I think that if that were the case, probably the only human right is involved would be the human right to property for the deep seabed mining contractors corporation. Tell me something about the origin of this sentence. It's a sentence, you're reading it, and then all of a sudden you go back and say, did I really read that? So what about deep seabed mining?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your puzzling, your question about your puzzling thoughts. I think that perhaps this is a result of some language that could be refined in this paragraph, is what you're directing me to here. And yes, I don't claim to, I don't lay claim to any particular conclusions on deep seabed mining or this particular issue, but what I had hoped to illustrate in this paragraph was that we have been talking about the role of non-state actors in customary international law, both broadly and in its formation. And the applicability is just of that customary international law to those actors is part of that discussion. And that this, I think one of the reasons that deep seabed mining then landed up rather surprisingly in this paragraph is just to show that this is something that has affected many different areas of international law and isn't restricted to the area of use of force or secession, for example, but that in fact we are considering the role of non-state actors more broadly speaking. But perhaps these kinds of what I call 3 a.m. thoughts are not always well articulated. So thank you for that prod to consider that for further refinement. I appreciate that.
Now I want to give Professor Stati the opportunity to continue the discussion.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, in response to Professor Leinzart's first question, you mentioned that in chapter 3 you were more concerned with the right, or rather the prohibition on the use of force rather than international humanitarian law. I think that's what you said towards the end. And that's correct. I do see that you are speaking a lot about the right to use force and how Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, or the custom international law rule that's contained in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, applies to or binds Taiwan. And there are a couple of questions that I might ask, but I'll focus really on just one. The argument that I understand you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, to be making is that the current binary approach is flawed because on the one hand, Taiwan is said to be bound by the rule and the prohibition on the use of force, because those rules apply to non-state actors. And by the way, there's some confusion there because sometimes you seem to suggest they apply, or sometimes you suggest they may apply, but so be that as it may, for now, let's just say you argue that they apply to non-state actors. But then you say that the non-state actors could not act in self-defense because that right only applies to states. And I wondered how correct these premises are. I mean, even if we accept, and in fact, I do accept that in principle, customary international law is applicable to non-state actors, surely one would have to look at the particular rule. So in this instance, you'd have to look at the rule on the prohibition and the use of force to see if that rule applies to non-state actors. So I wonder what your comment on that is. And in a sense, by the way, this is linked with a methodological question, because if you had identified one focal point, it would have allowed you to go into depth on that focal point in order to sort of develop the contours of that focal point. But I'd be very happy to hear your comments on that.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I think that on this particular point, I'm just thinking of the best way to tackle this, if you'll indulge me a moment of thought here. But I think that it is, you're quite correct then to say that we need to look at who the rule is directed at to some extent. And this is what came up in my discussion with Professor Fortin too, is that there's this moment where a non-state actor or a non-state effective territorial entity, in my case, we have to determine is it or is it not bound by a rule of customary international law. And then traditionally, one of the things that we look at then is the who this rule is directed at. And I think that in the chapter on Taiwan, one of the things that the research then seeks to do is show that there is space in the concept of capacity for Taiwan to be bound by this rule. And I don't think that the rule on the use of force necessarily excludes application to non-state effective territorial entities. So I don't see the problem of looking at the content of the rule there to say we can see that it would apply. But I think that is kind of my broad personal opinion, but I think that the sort of research shows that actually it does still matter for these rules whether a territorial entity is or is not a state. And this is something that is to some extent built into these rules, and that's partly why I think approaching it from the perspective more of a spectrum and reorienting our thinking in international law to the idea of this spectrum, given that these rules have developed over time where we really only thought about states. And are you a state? Yes, you are, then great, you have all this full set of rights and responsibilities. But now if we think about it differently, and it is reorganizing the thinking around actors in international law entirely, really, to say, well, these entities have capacity and we have to think about the rules that we have in that context. And I think that creates space then to step away from that and reconsider the application of that rule to these non-state effective territorial entities, regardless of how it's very specifically written at this particular point in time, purely because we are engaging in that transformative process.
Now, I know that also Professor Fortin is eager to continue the discussion.
Thank you. So in this thesis, you're really, I think, trying to shake up the legal framework a bit, at least trying to challenge some of the core lines along which the legal framework is written. And of course, subjectivity, legal personhood is the main one. Yet it strikes me as interesting that you're still sticking so firmly to territory. And you define the thesis as critical, and I'm guessing you probably know the field of critical legal geography, which very firmly kind of rejects a focus on territory, and says that instead we ought to be conceptualizing legal spaces not as being containers that rise up vertically from the territory, but as spaces, so as spaces being porous, diverse, fluid, relational, and that we really shouldn't be looking at territories anymore. And I think that we could see this indeed as being a more and more convincing argument if we think about cyberspace and these kinds of developments. So I wonder if you could reflect on your choice to continue to give such a priority to territory in your analysis, and comment on how important you find it to your theory, and I'm wondering why, for example, you didn't look at something different like power, function, or space instead.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for that question, which is a very interesting question, a very interesting topic, this movement away from territory in international law. I think that, at least doctrinally, territory still matters in international law, and it is still significant. And a lot of the problems that, or at least all of the problems in these chapters arise because of a loss of control, territorial control, and there's, as you know, some kind of confusion around whether it's the loss of territorial control or effective control, or what exactly that is. But ultimately, if we're looking at these foundational principles, they do still matter. And I wanted to show the problems with the legal framework as it is right now, so that we can develop solutions. And I think that then taking this pragmatic approach of saying, right, this is the framework that I don't agree with or support, but it's the framework within which my analysis is confined to operate, because they are the rules that apply right now. And I want to highlight the shortcomings of those rules. I think then that I've lost my train of thought slightly here, if you'll give me a second.
Well, maybe I can help you. So if I understand you correctly, you're looking at the law as it is, but your study also has a normative component as to how the law should be, and that comes out particularly in your conclusion. So maybe then I could ask you, thinking normatively about how you will redraw the lines of international law, how would you put territory on that map? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the reminder there. It was indeed helpful. I think that what I've got here is what we've got here is a situation where we have a very entrenched legal system that is built on this framework of territory being essential. And while I myself am skeptical about the place of territory in that system and this kind of idea of states and statehood and how that fits in, I think that we're confined to work within that system, at least for now, because it's very difficult to realize whole-scale change by just saying, right, wipe it all clean, we're going to start something new, we're going to work with power, function.
You may briefly conclude your reply.
Thank you. But essentially that it's unrealistic to expect that we can change the entire system to this completely new orientation, and instead we need to focus on how do we get there? And I think that by starting with highlighting some of the problems of these territorial issues, it's a starting point and a step in that direction.
Sarah Jane McGibbon, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company, both here and online, await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home, it feels it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like, my goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that.
On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off.
Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like, my goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like, my goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Sarah Jane McGibbon. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taken into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Wiedmar is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I now invite your supervisors to take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Sarah Jane McGibbon, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dr. McGibbon. When a new doctor is standing here, I usually try to go back and remember how the project had actually started. And usually I say, in the year so-and-so, you sent me an email. But in your case, it was the other way around. In 2017, I sent you an email. I was looking for an exceptionally strong candidate for one of the PhD positions here at our university. And my contacts at the University of Pretoria gave me an excellent recommendation. We had a few meetings over Skype and soon discovered that we were both interested in difficult conceptual questions of the law. We were both intrigued by the challenging underlying theoretical legal issues that lead to problems in a practical application of legal rules. You were at the time working as a practicing lawyer in your native South Africa, and you had previously clerked at the Constitutional Court of your country. Although your LLM degree at Cambridge focused on international law, your practical experience was more in the fields of constitutional and administrative law. And this was also your advantage. I have always subscribed to the wisdom that in order to be a good international lawyer, one first needs to be a good lawyer. The approach of your thesis was a difficult one and required a very detailed understanding and application of certain legal principles and doctrines beyond international law. But you are able to deliver precisely because you started this project as an outstanding lawyer. When I read the final version of the manuscript, I knew the necessary substance was there, and that your book was very strong and convincing. But I also had a strange feeling that something was missing, that the story was a bit incomplete. And it was not a substantive chapter that was missing. Something, but I did not know what. And then I received the printed book and saw the acknowledgements. I read them once, twice, 3 times, and you wrote that this wasn't an ordinary acknowledgement section of a book. Indeed, it was more of a sociology of your PhD process. And this is what was still missing. And with that addition, your book became complete, because you didn't only write an academic book, you also wrote an inspirational story around it. You reminded us that before we are scholars and lawyers, we are people. You reminded us that collegiality is not only about sitting next to each other and doing research in the same place, but also about supporting, understanding, and looking after each other. You reminded us that there is scholarship and that there is life. And life wasn't always easy on you in this period. But here we are today, and Wim and I always knew that this day would come. Sarah, you wrote that I never had any doubts in you, even when you had doubts in yourself. But why did I believe in you? Of course, it was clear from the very beginning that in terms of intellect and legal knowledge, you had everything necessary to write a good book. But life tested you on other fronts, and you won, because of who you are. Always honest to others and to yourself, always facing the challenges rather than trying to hide from them, always very collegial and trustworthy, committed to just causes, and always subscribing to strong ethical principles. It was these personal qualities that made me so convinced that one day we would stand here. And because of your positive personality, you also developed such a fantastic network of friendships in our scholarly community. During your time here, you didn't only finish your thesis, you also managed to publish scholarly articles, and together with our former colleague, Leah, we completed a comprehensive research handbook on secession. Your work on this project was instrumental, especially because its timing could not have been worse in the middle of the pandemic. But the book would not have been out without your efforts. So today, we are not only here celebrating a young doctor, because you already are an accomplished scholar. You started the project as an excellent lawyer and ended it as an excellent international lawyer too. When you were offered your current job as lecturer at Durham University in England, I wasn't surprised, just very, very happy for you. It is a new beginning in a rigorous academic environment and recognition of your immense talent and accomplishments. Congratulations on all your achievements, Dr. Sarah McGibbon. And again, I have no doubt that there would be many, many more.
Dear Dr. McGibbon, also on behalf of Maastricht University and its Faculty of Law, many congratulations on the degree that you just acquired. It's wonderful to see that you so very well defended your thesis, leading to the highest academic degree that was just conferred upon you by your supervisors, highest academic degree we have available here at this university. Congratulations to you, to your family and friends present both here in this room and also watching this ceremony online. And congratulations to your supervisors. And I also would like to thank very much the members of the degree committee present here today in Maastricht. And I'd like to mention in particular our guests from outside, Professors Fortin and Tladi. Very good to have you here with us. There will still be a reception that is going to take place in the inner courtyard of this beautiful building. And I already would like to ask everyone who is present here in the aula to go to that reception, except for the close family members on the first row, because we're still going to do one very special and traditional thing here in this room, and that is the making of the official photo of the young doctor together with her paranims and with her supervisors and with the committee and with the beadle. And we make the photo right here so that we also can have Professor Tladi present on that photo. And with that, I close this academic ceremony.
En dan like, doe ik. Het is like my G one is like a G. Yeah, it's like yours to hold. Look at it.
Sorry, I'm really dropping.
How are you feeling?